Hey bookworms, it's Jade from Bedtime Bookworm and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm here with my summer reading wrap-up. If this is the first seasonal wrap-up of mine that you've seen, let me explain what this is. In my seasonal wrap-ups, I go over all of the books that I read in that season. So for this one, I'm going to be going over the months of June, July, and August. In my monthly wrap-ups, I always go over the books that I read in the order that I read them, but for the seasonal wrap-ups, I try to rank them and put them in order of least favorite to most favorite. So I will quickly recap all of the books that I read in order of enjoyment, and then when I get to my top 5 favorite books that I read, I'll go into more depth about those books and explain why I enjoyed them so much. I always link my 3 monthly wrap-ups. That's really loud. Can you do this in here? Okay, sorry if you hear a weird sound. I cannot get my dog to stop chewing on her bone. Anyways, I always link the 3 monthly wrap-ups where I go in depth on all of these books in the description box in case you are interested in hearing more of my thoughts on any of the books that aren't in my top 5. So this summer I read a whopping 20 books, which might not sound like a lot to some people, but it's definitely a lot for me. I read 18 books in the spring and that already was a lot, so I can't believe that I read 20 books. Granted, one of them was a DNF, but I did read over half of that one before I decided to give up on it. So in the summer, as far as ratings, I had a pretty good spread. I definitely had way more 2 stars than I've had all year, but I also still had a lot of 4 and 5 star books. So this is how the ratings kind of shook out. I had 4 2-star books. I only had 2 3-star books. I had 8 4-star books, and I had 6 5-star books. Despite the number of 2-star ratings in here, I still am really happy with my reading from the summer. Ideally, most of what I read is 4 stars, and that's what happened. Alright, let's get into the books that I read. I'm actually a little nervous to go over this list of 2-star books because I had a couple of unpopular opinions in here. So at the bottom of my list, I have, of course, the one book that I DNF'd. Oh my god. At the bottom of my list, I have, of course, the one book that I DNF'd, and that was Something Borrowed, Something Blood-Soaked by Krista Carmen, which was a short story collection. Next, I have The Mirror King by Jodi Meadows, which is the second and final book in the Orphan Queen duology, followed by Wilder Girls by Rory Power, and then Cabin at the End of the World by Paul Tremblay. My 2 3-star reads were Kill River by Cameron Robeek, and The Blinding Knife by Brent Weeks, which is the second book in the Lightbringer series. And then getting into my 4-star books, these were definitely hard to put into an order because some of them were really close. But at the bottom of my 4-star list, I have I Call Upon Thee by Anya Alborn, I'll Give You the Sun by Jandy Nelson, House of Salt and Sorrows by Aaron A. Craig, The Downstairs Girl by Stacey Lee, Wicked Fox by Kat Cho, Half a King by Joe Abercrombie, which is the first book in the Shattered Sea series, Into the Drowning Deep by Mira Grant. And at the top of my 4-star list, I have The Black Prism by Brent Weeks, which is the first book in the Lightbringer series. That brings us to my 5-star reads. Like I said, I did have 6 5-stars, and so I had to pick one of these to not include in my top 5. And that was not an easy decision. But at the bottom of my 5-star reads, I have Gemina by Amy Kaufman and Jay Kristoff. The rest of these 5-star reads were really hard to put in any sort of order, so they're all really close. But my 5th favorite book that I read this summer was The Ruins by Scott Smith. This is an adult horror book, and it's what I would classify as survival horror. It's about a group of college kids, 2 couples, who, during their summer break, decide to go to Mexico. And while they are vacationing there, they meet and make friends with some other tourists. One of these tourists that they meet, his brother has disappeared. This brother left a note saying he was going with a girl to these Mayan ruins, but now it's been a while, he hasn't come back, and it's almost time for their flight back home. So these 2 couples go with their new tourist friends to try and find this guy's brother. Only when they get to this Mayan ruins, things are not quite what they seem, and they find that they can't leave. Like I said, it is a horror book, and there is quite a bit of body horror in this, so be aware of that before going in case that's not something you're comfortable with. This book really had me on the edge of my seat. I could hardly put it down. I did listen to a lot of it on audiobook, but I also had a paperback copy. Another thing that I don't think I actually mentioned in my wrap-up of this book is that this book has no chapters. It is multiple perspectives, so there are breaks when things switch perspectives, but there aren't actually any chapters in the book, which was a little strange at first. I thought this book was great to read in the summer because these characters are on summer break. They start out on the beach and then they go into this hot rainforest area. I read this in early June and it was a great way to kick off my summer. One of the things that I enjoy about survival horror, not that I've read a whole lot of them yet, but I definitely want to read more. So if you have any good survival horror recommendations, leave them for me down in the description box. But one thing that I like about survival horror is that you get a group of people, typically friends, that are in an isolated location trying to survive some horrific element, and you get to see their relationships slowly disintegrate over time. And I don't know what that says about me, but I find that fascinating and really fun to read. The horror element that is in this book definitely kind of took me by surprise. It wasn't what I was expecting going in. The synopsis of this book is obviously very vague about what is going on, and I had in my head that it was going to be something really different from what it ended up being, but it was right up my alley, and so it was a pleasant surprise. I really loved the body horror in this book. It made me uncomfortable, but at the same time, I couldn't get enough of it. Again, I don't know what that says about me. This book has been made into a movie, which I haven't watched yet, but I do hope to watch it one day. I think it would translate really great onto the screen. If you guys are looking for a summer horror book to read, I definitely recommend this one, as long as you're okay with some body horror. I would also recommend this book for fans of The Troop by Nick Cutter. I find that these two books are often recommended together, and I totally see why. If you like one, I feel like chances are high that you would like the other. So if you've read The Ruins, then that recommendation definitely goes the other way. If you haven't read The Troop by Nick Cutter, you should. Okay, moving on to my next favorite book from the summer. That's going to be Recursion by Blake Crouch. This is an adult science fiction thriller. I definitely had some high expectations going into this book because I absolutely adored Dark Matter by Blake Crouch. It was one of my favorite books of 2018. And while I tried not to compare these books too much while reading Recursion, the comparison was a little bit inevitable. I was also kind of nervous because I'd been seeing some mixed reviews about this book from people that I follow, but I am so happy that it worked for me. This is an adult science fiction thriller, and it focuses on two characters. You have Helena, who is a neuroscientist. She has been trying to invent a machine to help store memories so that people can relive them or possibly get their memories back because her mother has Alzheimer's. Then you have another storyline about a cop named Barry, and one day he is investigating a suicide of a woman who had something called false memory syndrome. And false memory syndrome is something that has been popping up where people one day will wake up with memories of lives they didn't live, and for some of these people, those memories seem so real and that life might be preferable to their actual life that they're currently living that they go on and commit suicide. So these two storylines start out in separate timelines at the beginning of the book, but then at some point they do converge. I found some complaints online that the pacing of the book was slow, and I do think that it was slower, especially in comparison to Dark Matter. Dark Matter is a super fast-paced book. The story really gets going right from the beginning, and this book was different from that. You get to know these two characters and see their stories start out separately, and then it's not until they meet that things really start getting crazy. But I found the second half of the book to be really thrilling and intense. This book also explores some similar themes to Dark Matter, but also some different ones. One thing that I loved about this book was the way that it explores memories. For some reason, the theme of memories in books always gets me. I'm kind of a sucker for it. And so because of that, I feel like this book was a really good match for my taste in particular. Also, while I didn't particularly connect with the characters early on in the story, by the end of the book, they definitely had grown on me, and I shed a few tears before it was all over, which was a little surprising considering how I felt about the characters at about the halfway mark. Overall, I thought this book was a blast. It's definitely not an easy read. You have to pay attention to what's going on. It's a little bit mind-bending, mind-blowing, but that's kind of what I loved about it. If you have read Dark Matter, I would recommend trying not to compare the two too much as you read Recursion because they are fairly different, especially when it comes to pacing. But if you haven't read Dark Matter yet, my personal recommendation is to start with Recursion and then read Dark Matter. I have seen people online recommend the opposite. I mean, there's really no wrong way to do it, but doing Recursion and then Dark Matter is what I personally would recommend. My next favorite book of the summer was Before We Were Yours by Lisa Wingate. This is an adult historical fiction book. This book is based on something that really happened here in the US. It's about a scandal that happened with the Tennessee Children's Home back in, I think it was around the 1920s. The story centers around a group of siblings who lived on a riverboat and one day basically get kidnapped and taken to this children's home where they are put up for adoption. So one of the point of views is from the oldest child in this family, and that's set in the past timeline. And then you also have a present timeline of a woman who is a lawyer. She's the daughter of a senator, I think. She's back at home helping out with her family affairs because her father has been sick. She's also engaged and having to do a little bit of long distance while she's at home, and her storyline is getting to the bottom of a family secret. This book really took me by surprise. I do enjoy historical fiction, but I don't pick it up often enough. The only reason I picked this one up was because it was a book club pick for my work book club, which meets every other month. And I'm so grateful that I ended up reading this book because I enjoyed it so much. I do have to admit that the past storyline, the one with the children going to the children's home, was the one that I found way more interesting. I just had a really hard time struggling with the woman in the present timeline. She's the daughter of a senator. She has a lot of privilege in her life, and I just didn't really connect with her. And it wasn't until later in the book when I was really able to start tying things together between the present timeline and the past timeline that I found her point of view to be interesting. This book was just really eye-opening to this thing that happened in the United States. This woman, I don't remember her name, it was Georgia something, she's in the book, but she basically was going around and kidnapping children from really poor families and adopting them out to really rich families. At the time, she was heralded as this person who made adoption be mainstream. And it wasn't until much, much later that it came out that this whole thing was a scam, that she was taking children away from families where they were wanted and basically selling them to really rich families and taking advantage of these rich families who all they wanted was to adopt children and would give anything, including a lot of money, to be able to adopt children. They had no idea that these kids were coming from homes where they were wanted. Like I said, I really love the past storyline, seeing from that oldest sibling's perspective. It was so heartbreaking because she was trying to keep her siblings together and seeing them be adopted out one by one, and there was nothing that she could do about it. It was so hard to read. I really loved how the story ended and how the two timelines were tied together and everything was wrapped up. I cried at the end, which, as I've admitted before, is not that hard to do, but I just loved this book so much. If you like historical fiction, if that plot sounds interesting to you at all, I definitely recommend checking this one out. And then my second favorite book of the summer is another horror book. It is And the Trees Crept In by Dawn Kurtagich. This is a YA horror book, and it had been on my TBR for quite a while, and it had been highly recommended to me to listen to it on audiobook, which I did, and it was fantastic. I also had a physical copy of it out from my library, and I do kind of recommend doing them together if you can. The physical book had some interesting formatting things going on, but if you have to pick one, definitely go with the audiobook. The plot of the story is about two siblings. You have Scylla, who is 16 or 17, and her little sister Nori, who is mute. She doesn't talk. She uses sign language, or maybe not actual sign language, but she communicates with Scylla through signing, and she seems to have a malformed arm or hand as well. Scylla and Nori have gone to their Aunt Kath's house. Something happened with Scylla's parents, and they had to move in with their Aunt Kath, who might be a little bit off her rocker. Scylla is doing her best to take care of Nori while living with this slightly crazy aunt that she doesn't know very well. And they live in this really creepy old house that, because Aunt Kath is slightly off her rocker, hasn't really been taken care of. I actually was really confused at first about the time period of this story because this house seems like it's set in like the 1800s. There's no electricity, but at some points Scylla made references to more modern technology. I think she references a cell phone at some point, or at least phone calls. But I do think that it's set in fairly modern times, but just this house that they're living in is very old and has not been updated. Anyways, one day, Scylla notices that the trees surrounding the house, surrounding the property, seem to be moving closer and closer each day. There was so much that I loved about this book. Even though it is a YA book, it does touch on some darker topics. If I had to classify what kind of horror this is, it's a little bit hard to put my finger on, but it definitely feels very much like a psychological thriller. You're seeing everything through Scylla's eyes and you don't really know if she's a reliable narrator. So I would go with part psychological thriller but also part haunted house story. I don't recommend this book for the faint of heart. It is definitely really creepy, especially if you listen to the audiobook. The audiobook, guys, is such a production. There's like sound effects, there's echoing. The narrator did an amazing job. The audiobook is definitely the way to go if you're gonna read this, but I wouldn't recommend like listening to it when you're home alone late at night. I don't get scared easily, and I wouldn't say I got scared, but it was like definitely creepy. This would be a really great book to read this October. I really loved Scylla's relationship with her sister Nori. She just is very much a caretaker of her sister. Scylla would do anything to protect Nori, and I loved that. There's a decent age gap between them, and I personally really related to that because I actually have a younger sister who is 11 years younger than me. There's also a romance in this book, but I personally didn't think it was like a cheesy YA romance. Like, I dug this romance. I thought it was slow burn, and it really got me in the feels. This was my first Dawn Kurtagich, and I'm definitely looking forward to reading more of her stuff. Alright, that brings me to my last and final book, my favorite book of the summer. This might not be a surprise to many of you, was Sorcery of Thorns by Margaret Rogerson. I have gushed about this book multiple times, it feels like, but I just loved it so much. This is a YA high fantasy book, and the main character is Elizabeth. She is an orphan who grew up in a magical library, and in this world, there are these magical grimoires, and depending on how dangerous of spells are contained within these grimoires, the more dangerous the grimoires are. And the really dangerous ones are locked up in cages, and there are these people called wardens who protect everybody else from these dangerous magical grimoires. Elizabeth works in the library right now, and her dream is to become a warden one day. Then, at the beginning of the book, one of these dangerous magical grimoires escapes from Elizabeth's library, and she's the one who saves the town from it. Which sounds great, but then she is accused of being the one who let the grimoire out in the first place, putting her dreams of being a warden in jeopardy. Elizabeth has to go on a trial and is paired up with a sorcerer named Nathaniel. Elizabeth is not happy about this because in her eyes, sorcerers are evil because they're the ones who use these dangerous magical grimoires. And from there, the two of them get tangled up in a conspiracy and have to basically, save the world. I loved this book so much, and honestly, it's a little hard to pinpoint exactly why. I love the world and the characters that Margaret Rogerson has created. Margaret Rogerson has a way of writing that is just a little bit whimsical and just made me so happy. This book is already really hyped here on BookTube, and I always feel bad adding to hype like that because I know this book isn't going to be for everyone. There's going to be people who read it and think that it's nothing special, just another run-of-the-mill YA book. But that's not how I felt at all. The feeling of this book reminded me a lot of like older YA. I've kind of compared it to Cinda Williams' Chima or the Bartimaeus trilogy by Jonathan Stroud. If you like either of those things, I think that you would like this book. It does have some YA tropes, but I thought they were all done really well. I really loved the romance. I thought it was super cute. I loved Elizabeth. She is a little bit of a naive character, but that's because she grew up very sheltered. And one of the themes in this book is learning that the world might not be what you thought it was. And once Elizabeth leaves the library, she's really forced to question her beliefs and come to her own conclusions based on what she sees in the world. There's another character that I forgot to mention named Silas. He is Nathaniel's demon, and in this world, sorcerers have to like bond or make a deal with a demon to get their magic. That's where they get their magic from. And I love Silas as a character, and I'm sure if you've seen any chatter about this book, you've heard of Silas. He's a little bit of a morally gray character, and I never knew if I could fully trust him. I feel like I haven't done a good job of explaining why I love this book, but it's just one of those books that I love so much that it's really hard to explain why. A lot of it was just the feeling that I had while I was reading this. I could hardly put it down, and it just made me so happy to read. I think I said in my wrap up that like this is a very Jade book. To me, this book was just so magical and whimsical. It was delightful. All of those words. Alright guys, so those were my top 5 favorite books that I read this summer. If you guys have read any of the books that I mentioned, let me know what you thought of them down in the comment section. Or let me know what some of your favorite books that you read this summer were. If you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you like bookish content. That is all I have for now. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, bookworms, keep reading. Bye. At the bottom of my to help store memories to help store memories so that people can and take into the and get and hasn't really been taken care hasn't really been run of the let me know what you thought. If you like this bit, bye.